Darling, are you almost ready? It's almost time for the ball to drop. Oh, there you are. Yes, I know it looks the same almost every year, but I still enjoy watching it. I like the tradition of marking and celebrating the end of one year and the beginning of a new. Taking that moment in the middle of winter to just contemplate where we are in our lives. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but we can always look forward to the next year and think about how we can improve it. No, I don't do that every year. I'd like to, but some years are just very distracted by other things that go on around us. But then, invariably by the next year, things have set themselves to right again. And if we remember, we can think about how chaotic the previous New Year was, and look at how far we've come since then. I suppose I still like to watch the ball drop because, well, it reminds me of how far I've come since the first time I saw it. No, I hadn't been to the first one. I'd been to previous celebrations. Before the ball was dropped, we used to go to Trinity Church, and there were fireworks until some bright person realized that perhaps setting off fireworks in the middle of the city was a bit of a fire hazard, and hence the ball drop. Oh, well, who thought of it? I don't really know. The idea of a ball drop wasn't new. It was already being done all around the world. From the tops of buildings that were high enough to be seen from the sea or from a harbor. Balls were dropped every day at noon for ship captains to set their chronometers to. We already had one in New York City on top of the Western Union building. It's not there anymore. But at the time, it was 10 stories high, visible from the harbor, and it was the official time of New York. So once the fire ban went into effect, I suppose somebody got the great idea that we don't really need fire. We could just light up a ball and drop it. Yeah, it was 1908. The ball lit up. Buildings had electric. Well, I mean, not all buildings. Actually, not even most buildings. But enough. It wasn't an unusual sight, especially not in a city like New York. But still. In fact, for that first New Year's ball drop, it wasn't even just the ball that was lit up. People who were in Times Square that day had these hats with little signs on it that said 1908. They all lit up at midnight. It was quite the novelty. But even then, we'd seen things like that before. If not personally, we'd heard about it. A good 20 years earlier, Alice Claypole Vanderbilt had gone to a masquerade ball dressed as Lady Liberty, holding a torch that was lit by battery. But I do think that it's safe to say that for people who attended that night, looking out from their restaurants or from the street, the lit-up ball with their light-up hats must have seemed somewhat like the future was upon us. And certainly it was. Look at us, sitting here far, far from Times Square, watching the ball drop over 100 years later. The ball has changed a few times since then, but it's still the same tradition. Still the same gathering of people, huge crowds, even the very first time, hundreds of thousands of people, all coming together to celebrate the new year and all the possibilities it brings. Yes, I have been there. Just once, actually, in all of these years. Oh, it was crowded. It was packed. It might not have been as deep as it is now, but there was still an amazing crowd. And you had to get there very early in the day in order to be able to have a spot where you could look up and see the ball drop. Yes, it really was quite the crush, as they said when I was young. So many people, so close together. But on the bright side, you could smoke in public. It was not only quite common, it wasn't a bad way to force a little space between you and the person next to you. Oh, goodness. I went in the 20s. Long-stemmed cigarette holders were popular, and I certainly had one. And so were giant stogies for men. I don't know if we were intentionally trying to keep people at a distance, but it worked. Well, for the most part. I don't know if everyone did the same thing, but I certainly noticed that talking with your hands while waving around a long-stemmed cigarette holder or a long cigar were certainly ways to keep people at a respectable distance. You just really did have to make sure that you didn't accidentally burn someone. Oh! I don't know how I could have forgotten that. What? Well, that day, that New Year's Eve in Times Square, ringing in 1928, the man I was on a date with had brought with him an especially large cigar to celebrate. That might seem like he was compensating for something, but what he was really compensating for were his social anxieties. Certainly we didn't have the word for it at the time, but he tried very hard to fit in, that boy, that young man. And those cigars were very popular. Also very popular at the time amongst a certain set of young men were long, thick-furred raccoon coats. It seems like a random bit of fashion history. I promise it's relevant to the story I'm about to tell. So, we are in this crowd, New Year's Eve, minutes before the ball drops, and there are these young men in front of us who are clearly wealthy college students. They were clearly students who were going to an Ivy League school. You could tell by their transatlantic accents and by the long raccoon coats. And if you didn't know by all of that, you would have known by the school fight song that they kept on singing. Crash through the line of blue and send the backs on round the end. Fight, fight for every yard. Princeton's honor to defend. Rah, rah, rah. Again and again and again. That wasn't the only line of the song, but it's the one that galled my date the most. He was from Yale, their biggest rival, and the source of the blue from that song. Crash through the line of blue and send the backs on round the end. At that point, Princeton and Yale had spent the previous 50 years dominating college football. In the 1800s, it was Princeton with Yale as its only contender. But since then, Yale had increasingly come out on top. That year, the year we were putting a pin in that night, Princeton hadn't lost to anyone except Yale, and only in the final game of the season. Now, certainly these Princeton boys couldn't have known that the man behind them was from Yale. But in their boisterous celebration, and their cheering for the supposed superiority of Princeton, they took to bashing Yale an awful lot. In between loudly and drunkenly singing that song. It wouldn't have taken a genius to realize that my date for that night was disgruntled with the display. And slowly but surely, he would nudge me, guide me, get me to move whenever a fraction of an inch appeared beside me. I assumed he was just trying to put distance between us and these obnoxious frat boys, but without falling back further into the crowd, further away from the soon-to-be dropping ball. But then I saw the smoke. The tip of his long cigar was tracing down the back of one of those knee-length raccoon coats. I reached for his hand, thinking it was a mistake, but he stayed my wrist and brought his hand back up in an upstroke, burning the letter Y into the singed fur of that coat. That's when I realized he'd done it twice already. He wasn't trying to just get me away from the frat boys. He was trying to get to the next one so that he could brand their coats with the letter Y. Now here's where the real problem comes in. There must have been something on that coat. The others had singed. They burned, they singed. That's what happens with hair and fur. It doesn't catch fire that easily. But this one burst into flames, just small flames, but still flames. And there we were in a crowd. I grabbed my date's hand and ducked back quickly. It's easier to back out of a crowd like that than it is to push to the side or get forward. People just fell in front of us, placing their bodies between us and the college students, which, thank goodness. But quickly one of them realized the college boy was on fire and started smacking his back to put out the flames. Of course, this caught the attention of him and his friends, and very quickly one of those bright sparks realized that more than one coat had been burned, and it was probably at the hand of one of the two people backing away very quickly. He started to give chase while his other friends remained to make sure that Mr. Oily Coat was properly extinguished. Now, as I say, a crowd will part well enough to let you out with the intentions of filling in the space that you just left behind. But getting out of a crowd like that is hardly a simple, unobstructed process. And there were two of us trying to get through, whereas there was only one of him weaving between the bodies. We may have had a head start on him, but it wasn't enough. My date and I broke up. Well, I don't mean to say we broke up, though I will admit that I never saw him again after that night. But what I mean to say in reference to this story is that we separated so that we could get through the crowd more easily, and he could only chase one of us. I'm going to choose to believe that our Princeton pal decided to follow me instead of my date, not because I was a woman and smaller than the man, but because I was closer. I will give him that much grace, because my date did, in fact, burn his coat. But the end result is that he was chasing me now, and not the actual vandal who caused the damage to his property. I don't mind admitting that when I finally broke out of the crowd, I ran without any real idea of where I was going. I ran toward the library, thinking for a moment that I might duck behind the lions, but my young pursuer might have actually been one of the football players he was so proud of, because he was very hot on my heels. I backtracked a little when I got to the next street. The buildings there had alleyways between them that went to the back, and more importantly, connected to other alleyways that led back out. I thought if I could get just enough space between the two of us, he could follow me into an alleyway, but he wouldn't know which road I'd popped back out on. He would probably give up, right? But then I got to that alleyway, and there was no one around. And it occurred to me, I'm a vampire. I don't need to run. Now, I know, biting someone without consent is strictly inappropriate. But he wasn't questioning how appropriate it was when he caught up with me and grabbed my arm and spun me around and grabbed my shoulders to give me, I don't know what, a good talking to. I only saw his face for a moment when he spun me around with that expression of pure, smug satisfaction and superiority. And then that moment of surprise when he realized that I wasn't resisting, I was lunging. Oh, no need to look so horrified, dear. Please. Of course I didn't drain him. Not completely. I just took enough to make him sleep for a while. And I even took the time to make it pleasant for him. Not that he deserved it. Honestly, coming for a woman smaller than he is. Crash through that line of blue and send the backs on round the end. I don't actually know what that means, but I like to imagine that's what I did to him that day. Oh, look, you're counting down. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year, darling. I'm very glad to have spent the past year with you. And I can't wait for so many more. Hey there, cupcakes. I didn't think I was going to be posting today. And I have to apologize to my patrons who usually get to see what I'm doing before I post it to the world. There were no previews of this story today because it came from me just thinking about New Year's and the old stories that I heard from older family members. The the bit about burning an old raccoon fur coat with a cigar is actually a true story from an older relative. Suffice it to say, there were no vampires involved. The burning was actually accidental, and backing into the crowd worked. There were no repercussions for the owner of the cigar. The person who told me that story is long, long since passed, and presumably so is the owner of the coat. But there is always a little bit of satisfaction in sharing their stories or a part of their stories with other people, sort of making a part of them live on beyond their lifetime. And this little flirty vampire character that you guys have all embraced so well, and her friend Dave, this character is full of stories borrowed from real people who once lived, and now I get to share elements of them, of their personality, of their experiences, with people who never could have met them. So, thank you. Thank you for being here for the past year. Thank you for listening to my stories. Thank you for letting me bring these people back to life for a little bit. And thank you so much for embracing them, because that means the world to me. So Happy New Year, cupcakes. There are almost 17,000 of you now, and each one of you is a blessing to me that I never could have imagined being here a year ago. I hope you spend tonight feeling as appreciated as you are, and I hope you spend the next year finding as many blessings as you've given me. Happy New Year.